it's something that I've been interested for quite a few years now. I got involved with a group of individuals who are interested not only in railroading, but model railroading. And these old fellows that I used to hang around with passed on to me a whole wealth of information about Erie and its railroad history. I always like to start my programs by pointing out one simple, very simple fact is that the peninsula is our key to existence. The Presque Peninsula was first discovered by the French back in the 1760s. They came in and settled it. And the reason they did is because it was probably one of the only natural harbors on the Great Lakes. And if you look at it as the Great Lakes as a kind of an interstate highway system at the time, there weren't very good roads except some Indian trails. And they relied an awful lot on traveling over the water. And of course, the Great Lakes being all connected, it was kind of like a interstate highway. And if you look at the Presque Peninsula and Erie's Harbor as a service plaza on the great interstate highway, attracting people and business into the area. To go back and look at railroads, the first railroad in the United States was built in 1827. It was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And it was just a very short line, only about 14 miles long, and it eventually evolved into a much larger railroad. We've had at least this many commercial railroads connected into the city of Erie. A lot of them are the same railroad by different names due to mergers and acquisitions amongst the different railroads. I'm just going to try to give you a brief overview of how many, how they were involved and where they were involved and kind of what kind of impact they had on our community. First of all, if you've recently watched, I recently watched on television a series called The Men Who Built America. Well, we had men in the city of Erie who built the city of Erie. These forward-looking gentlemen are responsible for much of what Erie became and what has become and what it is today. One of the first men I want to talk about is Rufus Reed. He was the son of Colonel Seth Reed, one of the first settlers into the city of Erie. They settled here in 1795. Immediately, they started a business. They saw the potential of the harbor. They built actually one of the first things built was a hotel and a tavern. They traded with the Indians. They got involved with government contracts, and they built one of the first things they did is start building ships so that they could transport goods all around the Great Lakes. And Rufus had a lot of foresight. His son Charles and he were pretty much business partners. He was his only son. Charles was a general in the United States militia. He was a lawyer, and he was worth about $5 million to $15 million when he passed away. That's about $743 million in today's money. Initially, the New York State completed the Erie Canal from Albany to Buffalo in 1825. And Pennsylvania realized that they needed to do a similar system. So in 1825, they began building their own. And it was completed in 1834. Now, the canal ran from Philadelphia into Pittsburgh. Now, during this time, Charles Reed had developed a fleet of ships. And about the same time, the steamboat was invented. And immediately, he and Rufus and other businessmen in Erie started building some steamships. Eventually, Charles Reed owned a fleet of ships, about 17 ships, and was considered a steamboat king, owning the most ships on the Great Lakes. And this canal offered them an opportunity because they could go to Buffalo and they would pick up passengers as well as freight that was headed westbound and deliver it to other ports. But when they looked at the Pennsylvania Canal system, they felt that a canal from Pittsburgh to Erie would not only service the state, but would also service their needs, allowing them to transport coal from the Pittsburgh area up into the Great Lakes so they could use them to power their steamships. So they approached the government of Pennsylvania and asked them to build a canal to do that. And of course, this time, Charles Reed was a congressman. They had a lot of state influence, and they were able to convince the construction. And the state began construction of the Erie Extension Canal, but they ran out of money. They couldn't complete it. And this is where Rufus and Charles Reed stepped in. They offered to take over the canal and complete it to Erie, and they did. And it was completed to Erie in 1844, 10 years after the state canal was started. Now, this canal not only offered a way for them to get their coal, but this also offered a new route for settlers to travel from Buffalo, from Europe to Buffalo on the Erie Canal, to Erie by Reed steamship lines onto the Erie Canal, going to Pittsburgh and get on the Ohio River system. And using that system, a lot of the settlers that settled the western part of our country passed through the city of Erie. Now, other people involved with him was John A. Tracy. John was the son-in-law to Daniel Dobbins. We know Daniel Dobbins was one of the movers and shakers and one of the most influential men in our city. He was father-in-law to William Scott, who I'll talk about in a little while. And he was an engineer. And he got together, and we'll talk about what they did, but they actually built the Erie and Northeast Railroad. His son, John F. Tracy, was also an engineer. He was a brother-in-law to William Scott, who we'll talk about in a bit. And he also worked on a Buffalo and Erie Railroad. And he became president of the Chicago Northwestern Railroad and actually built the first bridge over the Mississippi River. Now, W.L. Scott, William Scott, he was a congressional page, and he worked under, and he met Charles Reed in Congress. And Reed invited him to Erie to work for him. And he married John Avery Tracy's daughter. And later on, he got involved in the shipping business, and eventually not only owned a railroad, but he also owned 70,000 acres of land in coal mines in Pennsylvania, Illinois, Missouri, and Iowa. And he started the Erie and Pittsburgh Railroad. Now, his daughter married Charles Strong, who was a grandson of Pier St. Vincent Hammett, and his wife, he was a lawyer, and he went on to eventually take over some of the railroad companies and other interests from his father-in-law, William Scott. Now, the canal brought an awful lot of opportunities, but there were a lot of drawbacks to the canal. You couldn't ship in wintertime because it froze up. It was only so wide, and it would be, in order to transport enough volume, they would have had to widen the canal like they did in New York State, and they just weren't getting the efficiency. The canal really never made a lot of money. I mean, it did an awful lot to improve living in our community, but as a whole, it was not a really great business venture. So that's when Scott and the whole rest of the gang started looking to building railroads, because the railroads were up and coming at this time. And eventually the Erie Canal went out of business due to a failure of an aqueduct over Elk Creek. And at this same time, it was necessary to build railroads to compete with the canals. So in 1842, Charles Reed, John Tracy, and John Walker applied for a charter to build a railroad from Erie to Northeast, and actually to the state line. And it was completed in 1852. They had a passenger station located pretty much in the same vicinity of the Erie Erie's Union Station, in the same vicinity of Erie's Union Station. It was a short line railroad, only 18.5 miles long. It had a list of locomotives, but the most significant part of this railroad was built with what's called a 6-foot gauge of track. Now, the 6-foot gauge tracks were pretty common in Pennsylvania. The tracks in New York State were 4 foot 8.5 inches wide. A lot of engineers felt that the 6-foot gauge was better because it was more stable and it could have larger cars. But so they built the railroad from the state line in New York to the city of Erie with 6-foot gauge. Now, they wanted to continue the railroad across the city into Ohio. So Scott and Charles Reed formed a company called the Franklin Canal Company. And they used the money that they sold in stocks. Instead of building a canal, they built a railroad from Erie to the Ohio border. And it's tied in with another railroad that was on construction called the Cleveland, Painesville, and Ashtabula Railroad. And it came in Erie in 1852. The first train in Erie was 1852. Again, the tracks, like New York, was the gauge, or the width of the track was 4 feet 8.5 inches. It was called standard gauge at the time. Now, what happened was, let's explain gauges. Now, the gauge is the distance between the tracks, and as you can see, there's a 6-foot gauge, of course, is wider in distance than a 4.5 gauge. So the distance on the wheels of the cars and the locomotives on the Erie Northeast Railroad 6 foot apart, and on a standard gauge were 4 foot 8.5 inches apart, so the one couldn't travel on the other. So what happened was, it was actually, I guess, intended in order to have people stop in Erie. So in order for the passengers and the freight that was coming in from New York State to hook up with the Franklin Canal Company Railroad, which was going to Ohio, all the passengers and all the freight had to be unloaded from their cars and transferred to the trains that were headed westbound into Ohio. And it created a lot of jobs. It created different jobs for, of course, people carrying the goods. It created jobs for people selling food and beverages to the people who were the travelers as they were waiting for the transfer to be done. And even in private overnight accommodations for the people who stayed overnight. It was created a big business because they had to get off the train here. Well, what happened was the interest in Ohio and New York didn't like this because it interrupted the rail travel and it was not very efficient. So what they proceeded to do was to buy up excess stock of the Erie Northeast Railroad so that they could take control, and they went to standardize the tracks. So John F. Tracy was hired to do the engineering and to change the gauge of the tracks from 6-foot gauge to 4 feet 8.5 inches. And the people in the city of Erie did not like that idea. In fact, on December 7th, in 1853, the mayor led a group of citizens over to the Northeastern Railroad tracks, and they started to tear them out, and they had a riot, and they ripped up tracks, and the Gage War was nationally known. In fact, even Horace Greeley advertised, who was working at a paper in Erie at the time, spoke about it and wrote about it, and it's nationwide. It was settled and finally settled in courts, and the gauge was changed to be standard all the way from Buffalo into Cleveland. The thing about the Gage War is it changed the whole status of politics in the city of Erie. At that time, the city had been pretty much Republican. And then after the Gage War, the first Democratic congressman in Erie's history was elected. Now, what happened, this was the building of these short line railroads are pretty common throughout the United States. And they would start merging together. In other words, at one time, the Buffalo and State Line Railway took operations, the Erie Northeast Railway, because they bought up all the stocks. And then it became the Buffalo and Erie Railroad. And the Cleveland's Ashtabula Railroad acquired the Cleveland, Painesville, and Ashtabula Railroad acquired the Franklin Canal Company's railroad. And pretty soon they all became part of the Lake Shore Railroad, which eventually became the Lake Shore, Michigan Southern Railroad. And finally, it became the New York Central Railroad System. Today, the same tracks are in existence. It's now run by this CSX company, and they run through the city of Erie. Now, the Lakeshore, Michigan Southern Railroad at the time had an engine house and shops located right about where the Erie Metropolitan Transit Authority has their offices up on 14th and 15th, an area of French, between French and Parade Street. They operated there for years. They had another facility which was located at 14th and Sassafras. The building is still there. It was called the Rapid Transit Company for years. In fact, the sign, the Rapid Transit, was over the sign that's shown in this picture. About 4 years ago, I drove by, and the wind had blown the sign down, revealing that it still said in New York Central Railroad Freight House, and it's still there. Eventually, the railroad, New York Central, moved their operations into Wesleyville in 1922, and they set up a yard which just slightly on the east side of Water Street, north of Buffalo Road. It's just pretty much empty land in there right now, but they had a railroad yard there. They also had a roundhouse, and most of their facility was there. Now, it was time for another railroad. Up to this time, the trains just kind of passed through the city with stops, of course, for passengers and unload freight. But there were no railroads that went down to the waterfront. So the Sunbury and Erie Railroad was incorporated, and they started building in 1837. And eventually, in 1861, it became the Philadelphia and Erie Railroad. Well, our city fathers like to talk the Philadelphia and Erie Railroad to come into Erie to our waterfront. In order to do that, they transferred a whole section of water lots to them so that you could build docks along Holland Street in that area. And the first train that came up here was in 1864. The Philadelphia and Erie Railroad became part of the Pennsylvania Railroad system in 1870. It was kind of a different location because most of the railroads coming through here were going east and west, kind of along the lakes. They called it the water level route. It followed the rivers into Philadelphia, but this was the first real attempt to bring a railroad into Erie, which meant they had to come over the mountains of Pennsylvania. And what they did is they brought in anthracite coal, was their main product that they brought into Erie. This is the path of the railroad, because it shows you from Sunbury, Pennsylvania, up into Erie, up through Corey and Warren and Ridgeway and Emporium, and it followed through all those cities, not only bringing railroads to us for the first time, but also giving them access to the city of Erie. Just want to briefly show you something. This is the map of the Philadelphia and Erie Railroad. The tracks are still there. There's a railroad still operating on it. And it passes down through behind the casino up off of Route 97. It's about 1,200 feet high at that location. And it goes all the way to our waterfront, which is 560 feet above sea level. It's a drop of nearly 700 feet. It would have created a terrible climbing problem for the railroad to climb such a steep grade. So to do that, they looped it off of 97, down through Bell Valley, across Norcross Road, down into Wayne Street, and then down into the Bayfront. There's a drop of almost 700 feet. In order, by extending the distance, they were able to lower the work effort the engines had to make that height. Just a little note, they used to use a set of pushers in order to push the trains that were loaded with coal and iron ore out of the city up over to the bluff, using 2 inches at the head and 2 inches at the back. And they would take these trains till the road leveled off in the vicinity of what's now Jackson Station and Sampson Station. And they would take these pusher locomotives off, and the train would continue southward. Now, there was a passenger station at Front and State Street. They also owned all the docks, which are called the Anchorland docks we'll talk about. The Pennsylvania Railroad had a bigger impact or bigger footprint in Erie than in New York Central. They had yards at OD Yard and Warfel and Riblet yards. If you take a ride down a Bayfront Parkway behind what's now Walmart, there's a set of tracks. Well, that is the original Pennsylvania Railroad tracks. That was the Warfel Yard. They also had a facility on the west side of town called Dock Junction, which is a set of tracks located just east of Pittsburgh Avenue. And they had a freight house at 15th and Parade. They moved the passenger service moved to the Union Station later on. Now, believe it or not, there was a railroad station right on the corner of Front and State Street. It was there until 1880. It was part of the 150 water lots that the city of Erie deeded to the Pennsylvania or to the Philadelphia and Erie Railroad to build the docks. This is the east end of that passenger stations, the freight house portion of it, which was located again, like I said, right along Front Street. The Pennsylvania Philadelphia Area docks are also known as the Anchor Line docks. This is believe it or not, a 36-inch wide postcard that I purchased. It's photo is a panoramic photo of the Anchor Line docks in 1912. And these docks accommodated all kinds of freight. This is an aerial view that was taken in the early 50s. They had a grain elevator, which you can all remember. The Anchor Line had docks is for freight and for passenger distribution. There was another dock that was located on the same pier. That was the Hammermill Wood Dock, which the Hammermill imported pulpwood into the city for use at their mill. And next to that was a coal dock where coal was brought down and loaded into ships. And across the slip from that was the iron ore dock where iron ore was brought in from the Mesabi Range into Erie, unloaded and then shipped south to the steel mills. If we had more time, the operation of these docks were quite interesting. Some huge pieces of equipment worked there. It was a very efficient operation. The shippers liked to come in and out of here. There were times when there would be half a dozen ships just waiting out in the bay in order to unload or pick up their cargoes at our docks. The Pennsylvania Railroad ended up, of course, also owning the Philadelphia Area Railroad, also had a shipping company. It was called the Erie and Western Transportation Company. It was a branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad, of course. It was called the Anchor Line, and I'll show you why in a minute, why it was called the Anchor Line. This was their docks. If you would look at today, this is the Holland Street dock. And across the slip is the current Don John shipbuilding. But that is where the passenger and freight was unloaded on the right-hand dock. And in the left-hand dock was the grain elevator docks. It was known as the Anchor Line. It was formed in 1866. It had about 20 vessels. It stayed in business until 1915 when the federal government required that the railroads divest themselves of all their shipping interests. And it became the Great Lakes Transit Company and actually operated here until 1933. All the vessels were listed as Homeport Erie. This is just a few of the ships. They not only carried freight, but they also carried passengers. Later on, they were called packet ships. They were quite pretty. Inside, they had all of the amenities that you'd expect to see in a modern passenger ship. And this is the interior of the Juniata, which was one of the ships shown in a previous slide. And it's called the Anchor Line because you can see right on the bow of the ship, it says Octorara, the Pennsylvania Railroad is part of their line. And it wasn't unusual because the Erie Railroad had its own ships and the Grand Trunk Railroad had its own ships. A lot of them had car ferries. So it was not unusual for the railroads to have ships, but we had our own fleet of them here. This was just a picture of the grain elevators that were first built by the Anchor Line. They burned to the ground in 1815 and were replaced with concrete elevators in 1918. The railroads kind of came to the docks in Erie were lasted here to about 1960. And in New York Central, the Pennsylvania Railroad went bankrupt, and so they joined together and became the Penn Central Railroad. And what happened was that New York Central had docks at Cleveland and in several cities in Ohio, and the Erie docks became redundant, so they were closed. They were later taken over by the Litton Industries, and they turned those docks into a shipbuilding facility. They straddled one of the docks, the coal dock and the wood docks. They straddled them and built a dry dock, which is the longest on a Great Lakes. It's almost 1,300 feet long. It can accommodate any lake ship that's in there. Today, this is what it looks like. You can see there's a ship in the dry dock. There's the grain elevator dock is on the left. The middle and coal dock, wood and coal docks are the combined where the dry dock is, and the iron ore docks is now used by Erie Sand and Gravel. Other facilities in Erie, they had a yard at 14th and Wayne. This is a track plan. The Pennsylvania Railroad actually crossed the New York Central Railroad at a crossing called XC Tower in order to get to the bayfront. They had a nice roundhouse, and here's 13 images, a great picture. They had a freight station at 15th and Parade. It was destroyed by fire in 1969. I remember going by there when that fire was going on when I was first married. Like I said, the Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central became merged together, formed the Penn Central Railroad, and it was in business until around 1976. And then it went bankrupt and Conrail took over. Like I said, there were trains that ran down the streets. Here's a picture of a train on East 10th Street, right across from St. Anne's School. The Erie and Pittsburgh Railroad was started by Mr. William Scott in 1860. He had his headquarters for the Erie and Pittsburgh Railroad was located at 10th and State in what they call the Scott Building is now the hotel. Before that was the W.T. Grant Company. It was first incorporated in 1858, and it was in business until 1870, until it became part of the Pennsylvania Railroad system. It ran from Erie to Girard, and then Girard it turned south at Girard Junction towards Pittsburgh. It actually operated on the same tracks that the Franklin Canal Company had built. It's not unusual because Scott and Reed owned the Franklin Canal Company. So when he built the Erie Pittsburgh Railroad, of course, they gave him track rights on that line. And the Erie and Pittsburgh Railroad bought out the Erie Extension Canal at Sheriff's Sale in 1870. And in Erie, they had facilities, what we now call the Cascade Docks, which is located at the foot of Cascade. This is, again, another 1912 panoramic photo. They handled coal and iron ore, just like the West Side Docks, except their coal was soft coal. And the piers, as they are, was built in the 1864 was the center pier. We call it Perry's Landing. It was converted to iron ore. The West Pier, which is where the condominiums are on the bayfront, was built for coal handling and had coal and loading. And the East Pier, which is the Liberty Pier, also held iron ore. And pretty much the operations of as shipping docks was pretty much over with after World War I. However, they were still kept in use. Now, these are an area view of the docks taken in 1966. It shows the center pier being the first, and of course the pier at the bottom was where the condos are. That's 1868, and 1870 was what we call Liberty Pier. This was the original track plan. You can see how the tracks ran out. Now the trade tracks from there went across up alongside up across 8th Street to 12th Street, and then parallel into Green Guard, what they call Dock Junction, and that's where the E&P Railroad came into a junction with the New York Central Railroad so that they could travel into Girard. After the docks were closed for coal and oil iron ore handling, they were repurposed. The United Oil Manufacturing Company set up tanks, and they were bringing in oil, crude oil. Some of the docks were used for stone and other bulk commodities. And then the center dock was run by a concrete company, Erie Builders Concrete. This is just a tanker ship unloading at one of the docks. During the Second World War, the docks where the condominiums are was Perry Shipbuilding. They built 36 Navy vessels at that site during the Second World War. It operated not only as a shipbuilding facility, but also as a repair facility for lake carriers, until it was sold by Charles, I can't think of his name right offhand. And that is where the condominiums are located now, and they started to develop there back in the 1980s. This is what it kind of looked like in 1960 with all the coal cars being stored as the coal was being shipped out of Erie Docks. And this is what it looks like today. Of course, you see the condominiums in the foreground, and then the Perry's Landing Marina, and then beyond that is the Liberty Pier. This is what it looked like from the air with the train traveling down it. And today that same route is a route of the Bayfront Parkway. Now, the Erie's Union Station, the two railroads decided to join together. This is what was called the Union Station. It serviced the Philadelphia and Erie Railroad, or Buffalo and Erie, and then later on the Pennsylvania and the Lakeshore, Michigan Southern. This was the first station. It was replaced in 1927. It was rebuilt. And the idea was to raise the right-of-way of the railroads above the city streets so that the cars could go under it, because it was a real nuisance. We had about 70 or 80 trains going through every day, and the cars that tried to travel up Sassafras, State Street, and all those streets were having a hard time crossing. There was a lot of accidents. So they decided to raise the whole level so that the streets could go under into the underpasses. They built underpasses. They built a temporary station off of French Street to handle it. And of course, you can see there's an underpass located right there. And eventually, this is what it looked like. They were above the normal street level. The tracks, there were 6 tracks. 2 were Pennsylvania Railroad and 4 was the New York Central Railroad. They had canopies so that the passengers could discharge in bad weather. They built underpasses at French Street, Division Street, Parade Street, and Ash Street, and west of State, Peach Street, Sass, Cherry, and Liberty. And they built overpasses at Peninsula Drive, East Avenue, and Franklin Avenue. I don't know why they never finished any underpasses at Cherry or Pittsburgh Avenue. That would have really been helped. So consequently, you have to stop and wait for the trains in any of those intersections. This is the Union Station shown on a postcard view. Some interior photos of the Union Station. If you go there today, of course, it's now a restaurant. It hasn't changed much, except for the fact there's no passengers. They've added some other amenities to it, but this is what it looked like in its heyday. I can remember going there back in the late 1940s to pick up people that would come into town and bring them over to the house. They also had a railroad express facility. I'll let you know there's a tunnel that runs between the Union Station and what was the old post office building, and that's how they brought the mail from the post office to the express cars underneath the park and underneath the street. Just a nice slide showing 2 steam engines side by side. At its peak, there were about 52 trains a day, passenger trains in and out of the station. By 1960, the New York Central only had 8, and the Penn Center only had 4. And the Pennsylvania Railroad to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and they stopped the service in 1946, and the Philadelphia service stopped in 1965. Now today, Amtrak has taken over. It started in 1971. The service has stopped. It was stopped in. It consists today of 1 train per day. They're mostly one comes in at 2 o'clock from the east, and another one leaves Erie at 6 o'clock for the west. Now there were other tycoons, not from Erie, who had a big influence. Jay Gould and William Vanderbilt had a loggerhead. Vanderbilt owned the New York Central Railroad, and Gould owned at that time was called the Nickel Plate Railroad, and New York, Chicago, and St. Louis Railroad. And they were in great competition, and they wanted to come to Erie. There was a big deal because they thought most of the shippers felt that competition would be good and help lower the price of shipping. So Nickel Plate decided to run in through Erie, and they decided to pick the middle of 19th Street. Remember the old 19th Street tracks? There was a lot of opposition from the homeowners. They didn't want a train running down the middle of their street. But in the middle of the night on Sunday, April 2nd, the crew came in and laid the track, and he picked the weekend because the courts were closed and he couldn't get an injunction. And it was finally in 1882, it was completed over 19th Street. And it ran that there for years. They had a station, Nickel Plate Railroad, as it was called, at a station at the yard at 19th and Holland, and a railroad station, or a passenger station right nearby at 19th and German. They had a passenger service that they ran into Erie. They had 4 trains a day, 2 in and 2 out, and that proceeded to run until 1965. They had the longest bridge in the system. It went across what was the Pennsylvania Railroad yard on Buffalo Road, all over past over that whole huge yard. It was the longest. It was 3,233 long. It's been replaced since then, and the route of the New York Central, the Nickel Plate Railroad has changed because it caused a problem. They traveled on 19th Street tracks. They had to deal with cars driving close by them. There was not unusual to have a wreck that caused a lot of injuries and a lot of problems. And for years, the city fathers tried to lobby the New York Central to let the Nickel Plate run a track parallel to theirs to avoid running through the city. And he finally did that. And in 2001, the last train came over it, and tracks were removed in October 12th, 2001. They actually brought in a special passenger train, which I was afforded the opportunity to travel on. And the mayor and the city officials gathered, and they took the spikes out of the track, and they eventually bypassed that area by running parallel to the New York Central tracks as they do today. And they still run through the city, but parallel to the New York Central tracks. Nickel Plate also merged. Again, they merged with the Norfolk and Western Railroad, and then the Southern Railroad came in, and now it's called the Norfolk Southern Railroad. And they acquired half of Conrail, which we'll talk about. Now, we had another railroad came in here, was the Bessemer. The railroad was Bessemer and Lake Erie Railroad. When the canal closed, we left a void amongst the people along its path because they lost. So they decided to build a railroad. It was called the Pittsburgh, Shenango, and Lake Erie Railroad. And they were able to acquire the land, and they were able to, after the canal went out of business. And actually, Mrs. Sarah Reed bought the assets of the company when the Pennsylvania, Shenango, and Lake Erie ran out of money, and they started to build a railroad along the canal path from, of course, again from Bessemer, Pennsylvania, up into Erie and Conneaut. And they were able to obtain, they didn't have rights to come in, so the Pittsburgh, Shenango, and Lake Erie was completed to Wallace Junction and Girard. And then it turned eastbound, and they followed the New York Nickel Plate Railroad, or the Norfolk Southern Railroad as is today, from Wallace Junction to Cascade and Erie. So it was called the Erie Terminal Railroad Company in order to accomplish the legality of it. And they actually became the Bessemer and Lake Erie in 1897. Now, the reason it was acquired by Andrew Carnegie, who needed a railroad to bring his iron ore from Mesabi into Pittsburgh. So he split the railroad at Conneaut and ran a branch from Albion into Conneaut, and the other branch came into Erie. And it was named the Bessemer and Lake Erie in 1900. Conrail came in. It was formed by the federal government to take over the Penn Central went bankrupt, and Erie Lackawanna Railroad went bankrupt, so it became Conrail. And then Conrail stayed in business till 1998, and the company, it was split evenly. Any rights that belonged to the New York Central Railroad was turned over to CSX, and anything belonging to the Pennsylvania Railroad was turned over to the Norfolk Southern Railroad. Again, like I said, the Bessemer and Lake Erie followed the route of the Nickel Plate. Here it is shown crossing the Swanville Bridge out in Fairview. It came into Erie about Green Garden, makes a little left turn, passes by the old Erie Forge and Steel Company, and goes underneath the CSX or North Central tracks and out onto 12th Street. At 12th and Cranberry, they had a small yard. They had a freight station and a passenger station located at Peach and at 12th and Sassafras. And you can see this is a photo of a Pittsburgh Lake Erie train traveling on West 12th Street, alongside West 12th Street. They also crossed over in a couple of places. It switched locomotive switched cars into Bucyrus Erie Company, which was located on the north side of 12th Street, and it crossed right near Cranberry. They had another track that went into the Odin Stove Company over by Sassafras. They had a passenger station at 12th and Peach. It was replaced by a frame structure in 1898. It was torn down in 1957 when they widened 12th Street. They took the tracks out for the Pittsburgh Lake Erie Railroad. And the last run was a passenger train in Erie was 1955. Now the Canadian National Railway bought out the Pittsburgh Lake Erie. It still exists. However, I have not seen any of the trains come in Erie for years. However, they do run a periodic train in and out of the Conneaut Harbor, and they bring iron ore pellets called taconite from Conneaut into the Pittsburgh area. It's now, like I said, the Canadian National owns it now. Or other railroads in town, there's an East Erie Commercial Railroad that's still in operation. It's basically a subsidiary of General Electric. And it was formed in 1911 to handle everything that's going on plant. It has a station or an engine house on Water Street on the east end of the General Electric plant, or I guess is as I still call it. It also is responsible for the tracks that they have is used for the GE test locomotives. And it has a little yard alongside the CSX main. This is just a bunch of trains you'll go by. Even today you'll go by. General Electric takes in trains which they kind of recycle the parts, and it's kind of a recycle area for used locomotives. And they also had some trackage on East 10th Street, and periodically you'd see a train bringing operating in 10th Street near Franklin Avenue. Now, Hammer Mill had a train. They had an own operation. They had a wood yard. All the wood that was brought in by ship was taken and stored in a yard, which was on the south side of East Lake Road. And they would operate trains bringing the pulpwood and other commodities in and out of the plant. This is just a postcard showing some of the piles of logs used for pulpwood. The Allegheny Railroad was the original Pennsy. When it went out of business, the Allegheny Railroad was bought by Hammer Mill so that it could bring pulpwood into Erie along it. It was a sole owner. Eventually, it's now a subsidiary of a couple of different companies that have taken it over, and it still operates. If you still see cars alongside the, let me turn the light on here. You can still see a car that, some cars sitting there alongside the Walmart on the Bayfront Parkway. You'll see this is what it looks like along the Bayfront Parkway. And other companies, Bucyrus Erie had a small railroad, Erie Iron Works, Liberty Iron and Metal had a railroad, Perry Iron Works had a railroad, and so did Penelec. They all had little cars. They'd move their, mostly coal cars around their plants in order to feed their boilers. Railroad manufacturing in Erie was, from the get-go, was a big deal. Of course, General Electric was here. And then we had the Heiser Locomotive Company, Erie Car Works, where they build cars. There was Standards Stoker. And in Corey, there was another plant called the Climax Locomotive Works. This was inside of GE when it was in its heyday. And then the Heiser Gear Locomotive Company, they were very, very well famous. They were in business for quite a few years. And I want to point out that Mr. F.F. Kurtze, the owner of the Kurtze Watson, one of the owners of Kurtze Watson Mansion, which is our headquarters, was the president of the Heiser Locomotive Company. And they were located between around 16th and Hickory. They built steam locomotives that was different. It was a narrow gauge. Remember, we talked about gauges. They built a gauge that was narrower than a standard gauge. It was easier for them to run short distance tracks and make quick turns. And instead of being piston driven, they were gear driven. And the design of the locomotive came about 1892, and they actually kept building those locomotives until 1941. Last time I checked, there's 32 of them still exist, and some of them were used extensively out around the mining areas, the silver mines out in Nevada and Utah and that area. The geared locomotives were used a lot in the logging industry in Pennsylvania. Erie Car Works was located at 16th and Raspberry. They built railroad cars, employed about 600 workers. They did not make passenger cars. Standard Stoker Company, where my grandfather used to work in a foundry, they invented a gadget that would, instead of having a fireman on a locomotive shovel coal into the boiler, they had a machine that would take and carry the coal out of the tender into the engine and feed the boiler in that manner. Now, the Climax Locomotive Works was in Corey. He invented this locomotive in 1858. And they, again, were another locomotive very similar to the Heisler's. They were a mining locomotive, and they were built between 1880 and 1937. There's 23 of those still exist. However, you can go to the museum in Corey, and you can see one of them on display. They've restored it, and it's on display down there. What's left of the railroads? They had yards. CSX is still in operation. Right now, they have a yard along the bayfront, which used to be used to store coal cars for the coke plant. However, the Port Authority is negotiating with them to relinquish part of that area so they can modify the Bayfront Parkway so it flows underneath State Street. And in order to do that, they needed to run it through the tunnel right now that the railroad comes under. They still service, you can tell who started this program, but before GE was acquired, they still service GE and the Bonneford Terminal on the Bayfront, Don John Shipbuilding. Norfolk Southern still comes in the area. They service a lot of the plastics plants along 19th Street. Of course, the Buffalo and Erie Railroad comes in and brings freight into, and mostly plastics, to our companies along the old Pennsylvania Railroad route. We had other railroads in the city. We had trolleys. The first trolley was horse-driven, introduced in 1867. They had their headquarters, which was these, right now owned mostly by Hammond property, owned by the Hammond Hospital at 2nd and State. They were the first, one of the first railroads in the United States in 1889 to trolley to become electric. And we have that. I think they were like one of the second or third in the country to have an electric trolley system. There were actually, again, like other railroads, smaller to merge into larger, but when it was all said and done, towards the end of it, there were 4 different traction companies or trolley companies here. There was Erie Railways, which was part of the original. They had the Conneaut and Erie Traction Company, which traveled mostly along Route 20, and a Buffalo and Lake Erie Traction Company that ran a course like Buffalo, and that was along Buffalo Road into Buffalo and through Barcelona and Dunkirk and Fredonia and all into Buffalo. And then there was a Northwestern Pennsylvania Railway, which was a trolley company that ran from Erie to Meadville. And the timeline in 1911, 1912, trolley passenger ridership was at its all-time high. The Grand Union, which I'll show you a picture of, was at State Street, where they all kind of came together. The last, 1922, the last Conneaut and Erie Traction Company ran. 1928, the last train from trolley to Meadville ran. In 1935, the last Erie Railways trolley ran. This is a photo of trolleys at GE, bringing workers in and out. In order to generate ridership on the weekends, the trolley companies brought their lines to amusement parks. Waldemere, 4 Mile Creek, and Mississauga Point Hotel was serviced by the Erie City Railways. The Conneaut and Erie Traction Company had Elk Creek Park, and the Buffalo and Lake Erie Traction Company had Orchard Beach Park. This is not unusual. The passengers would load on the trolleys. Here's the getting ready for a Boston Store picnic, which was probably going to Waldemere. Waldemere had a trolley station right at its entrance to bring the trolleys in. The Grove House, or 4 Mile Creek Park, had a trolley that ran in off the line, and it was in operation. Mississauga Point Hotel, which was located at the foot of Summerheim Drive, actually had trolley service. The hotel was owned by Mr. Scott, W.L. Scott, and John A. Tracy. It operated for many years, and the trolley line used to run down from A Street down to the hotel. And in fact, if you go there today, you can still see the path. If you go to Sarah's, you can see how it came down the hill. Elk Creek Park was located off of Elk Creek Road in, I believe it's Fairview, Girard, between Fairview and Girard. They had a substation there. That building is still existent. Just for the heck of it, I took a look today and see if it's still there. There was a park down there. Orchard Beach Park, which is just off of Orchard Beach Road on Lake Bank off of Northeast, had another park. At 12th and State, there was a Grand Union. They actually had a person that would direct the trolleys. The trolleys from all those different lines crossed together there, and they had to have like a traffic cop in order to keep them from colliding with each other. These are just a couple of photos of trolleys in North Park Road. You could spend a whole program just talking about trolleys. You could spend a whole program just talking about the Bayfront railroading system. Here's just a photo of the Conneaut and Erie Traction Company, a picture of a trolley in Girard. This was a map of the Buffalo and Erie railway system, Matt, showing where the cities had covered all along, pretty much right along, parallel to the New York Central tracks along Route 20. This is the Northwestern Pennsylvania car number 103, which would travel to Meadville on its run. That car carried both passengers as well as freight. You can still see that car. It's located at the corner of Route 99 and 6N in Edinburgh. It's now the diner. It's a Crossroads Diner. The trolley is still there, and you can go have lunch in it. This is the same car going through Edinburgh. Now, my wife's grandfather, Harold Nash, was an engineer on a locomotive. My wife is the second kid from the grandfather, closing on the last day of his work on the Pennsylvania Railroad, and that is all her cousins and located on the same engine. So that's the end. Are there any questions?
Well, Jerry, that was fantastic. As Sarah said today, everybody loves trains, and I think we all do. And I think we all miss the fact that they're no longer available. I think that what we're going to do in the interest of time, and because we are having some technology problems, is I'm going to ask anyone who has questions for you to leave your questions in the Facebook comments question, and we'll forward them to Jerry and we'll return them to you. If that's okay with you, Jerry?
Yeah, it's fine with me. Was I interrupted or?
No, I think you were fine.
Was there any problem?
You went fine.
Okay.
But after, please reach out to us through Facebook, or you can email me at our Facebook page, www.eriehistory.com. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Sarah Little, our tech support, for your support of tonight. And all of you who watched online, join us on Wednesday, April 21st at 7 p.m. when Mike Jerzewski and Jim Wirtz of the United Way in Erie will answer the question, why do you work to crush poverty every day? Please join us.